This is my first time in Copenhagen. I've been wandering around your wonderful city, actually 2 cities with Christiania for the last 48 hours, and just loving it. I'm someone who likes cities, the ancient ones and the modern ones, and so the theme today is about a city, of course, the one behind me, Teotihuacan in central Mexico, just very close to Mexico City. And here it is, fancily reconstructed in its height. And so I wanted to start broadly with this issue of understanding cities. Let's see if I can advance. Okay, yeah. Why should we care? Why? What's the point of studying early cities? These seem like they're ruined places and lost to time. Are they relevant to us today, living in the modern world? And I hope to have the take-home point today that, yes, I believe that they are. And looking at this map over here gives you an indication of how we as a species have become more urban over the last 50, 60 years. And so here in the Americas, of course, and in Europe are areas that have been highly urbanized, well over half the population living in cities for many decades now. But then other parts of the world are catching up, Asia and Africa in particular, becoming more urban. So this is the dominant settlement type of human societies. When did they arise? How are they different? What perspectives do we get from archaeology? Well, first, at the very least, we're increasing our sample size. So if we only consider cities of the present or of the historical record, we're dealing with dozens, maybe low hundreds of cities, where we have thousands of cities going back thousands of years through the archaeological record. And so not just ones that are documented textually, but ones that can be excavated. And so that's one of the things that archaeologists do. We focus on the material. How does space work? How is space structuring action? How does action structure space? What are the tangible relics of everyday life, the artifacts that people use and come into contact with? And so that material focus is something that I think archaeology adds to the broader discussions of urban studies. And really importantly, and I'll get to this point later in the talk, including commoners. So historical texts usually prioritize elite males, and lost in the picture are people, the 95%, the 99% of humanity that created ancient cities, and archaeology has a perspective on that. We, of course, also have a perspective of long change over time, diachronic change. So going from the earliest days of our species to developing farming, to developing big settlements that later become cities, state capitals. And we can see that certain processes in past cities are still relevant today. So, we talk about neighborhoods or ethnic migration to different cities. This is stuff that's been going on for thousands of years. And so we have a perspective on why people came to cities, how they got incorporated into cities. Scaling, there's a lot of fascinating work going on urban scaling processes. In general, as population increases, urban infrastructure increases below that rate because cities are efficient. There are scalar efficiencies in cities. You don't need as many roads per capita or sewage per capita because of those scalar efficiencies. But social reactors, the stuff that makes cities exciting, that's increasing at a rate above population growth. So an event like Science and Cocktails could only happen in a city, or it can only happen in association with some sort of urban populace that's bringing this all together. So now to take you to Mexico, I know I've spoken with some of you today, but just a show of hands, how many people have been to Mexico before? Oh, nice. Okay, good. And Mexico City? Maybe 10% or so, and then Teotihuacan. Oh, excellent. Okay, so we have some experts, but this is a place you all should go. Mexico City's lovely, and the ruins here are quite accessible from Mexico City itself. So those of you who are already familiar with central Mexico know that Mexico City is built over the ruins of the Aztec imperial capital of Tenochtitlan, and so that was dismantled by Cortez and the Spanish, the major monuments, and they became the monuments of state for Mexico today, the cathedral, the national palace, etc. But Central Mexico actually contains layers of urbanism. This is an area that has been one of the most densely occupied on the globe for 2,500 years, going back to really early mid-first millennium before the Common Era, cities like Coahuilco, which now is south of Mexico City. This is sort of near the university and where the Olympic Village was when the Olympics were there in 1968. This is what we could call really the first city in central Mexico. Teotihuacan, what I'm going to focus on is the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era. It collapses into smaller city-states, not really represented here, that then become the Toltec state, and then that collapses again and becomes the Aztec state. So there have been these cycles of urbanism, really long-lived urbanism, which makes it an exciting place to study. One of the questions most often asked is, who are the Teotihuacanos? What is this name, Teotihuacan? What does it mean? It comes to us from the later Aztecs. So the Aztecs are in this area about 700 years or so after Teotihuacan. And the name Teotihuacan means place of the gods, or place where one becomes a god. And this relates to this critical legend for the Aztecs called the legend of the suns, which was that to start the fifth sun of creation, the Aztecs viewed themselves as being in the fifth cycle of the sun. The proto-gods sacrificed themselves at Teotihuacan and became the sun and moon. And this is a pre-Columbian codice depicting that. But at the same time, the Aztecs knew that this was a city of people. And they went there and they dug stuff up. They were the first archaeologists of Teotihuacan. And they found things and they brought them back to their sacred temple, the Temple Mayor that was up on the top on that last slide. This wasn't found there, it was found south of Mexico City, but it's a lovely mask. I'm going to show a mask later that from our excavations at the end of the talk. But this one is a Teotihuacan mask, the stone mask, but all of this inlay of turquoise. Turquoise was a commodity that wasn't traded for until later, after Teotihuacan. It comes from northern Mexico and the American Southwest, and there were trade routes running up into that area. And so some later Aztec artisan got a hold of this Teotihuacano mask and put this beautiful mosaic work on top of it. And I love it as a visual metaphor of Aztec society, because Aztec society builds on a Teotihuacan base, just like this mask shows. So how did Teotihuacan come about? It started with a bang, so to speak, in that there was a massive volcanic eruption. This is Mexico City today, and next to it is the Smoking Mountain. The name in Nahuatl is Popocatépetl, which means the Smoking Mountain, and it is active near this city of 25 million people, and so it's one of the most closely watched volcanoes in all of the world. And it had a huge eruption in the 1st century. This is the 1st century of the Common Era, but prior to that, this is Coahuilco, that one I showed you that was in the bottom of the last graph. This was a big city, and Teotihuacan starts developing up here as a second city within the basin of Mexico. Mexico City now encompasses all of this area. With Popocatépet's eruption, this was a huge eruption. A volcanist would call it a VEI-6 eruption, which for comparison is when Krakatoa erupted in Indonesia, and it could be heard in Australia. It's that scale of eruption that erupted sometime in the 1st century, and it completely changed settlement here. This is an area that receives more water, is more conducive to human settlement and farming, and it got cleared out. And this ashfall reigned particularly to the east, where this second big city developed named Cholula. It was the second big classic city of the time. Actually, the biggest pyramid is here, not at Teotihuacan, Cholula. You might know it as a hot sauce. It's a very good hot sauce if you like that. And Teotihuacan really became the big center, though. This is an area that's drier. It doesn't receive as much rainfall, but it has permanent springs that allow for irrigation, and this became the breadbasket then of Teotihuacan. So people congregated here, migrants fleeing this volcanic activity to the south. eventually, it grew to become the size of imperial Rome in scale. So these are to scale, the same imperial Rome and Teotihuacan. But Teotihuacan is about 100 to 150,000 people at its max. These are largely contemporary cities, whereas Rome could be 500,000 to 1 million. And that's because in Rome, people were living in 3, 4-story housing, where in Teotihuacan, it's this lower ranch living. But nevertheless, this was like really impressive. The monuments, this is compared to the largest pyramid in Egypt, Khufu's pyramid, as wide as the base, obviously not as high, but very different monuments. So in the Egyptian pyramids, these are mortuary monuments for a king. These are temples that you walk up the staircase and there's a temple structure on top. And then this housing, if you look at the grid plan, all these structures, these apartment compounds are all laid out in this very organized way on this grid. So another reconstruction here that brings up, what is interesting about Teotihuacan for understanding cities more broadly. First, it's a site that was abandoned. So unlike Aztec centers, when the Spanish came, those Aztec centers transitioned to colonial towns. They were dismantled and a new colonial city went on top, and they're very hard for us to study archaeologically because they're just covered over. So since this had been abandoned, it's available for us to study. It's in a semi-arid landscape, which means that archaeologists could go around mapping where structures are and make a good estimate of where people were living and how large the city was. But then some of the characteristics of the city, its size for its time. It was the largest city in the Americas at its height, not in the world. Rome, again, was larger. But the fact that it was cosmopolitan, drawing multiple ethnic groups speaking different languages to this place, that it has this high degree of planning, these are all things we expect of our modern cities. And so Teotihuacan then acts as a case that we can compare with cities of historically documented times or modern times. And so to do that, I just wanted to throw Teotihuacan over your fair city here of Copenhagen. And please excuse me while I butcher most of these names, but where the Castellet, the citadel structure up here, I went up there, saw people jogging around the walls. There's really cool views of the city. That's near, over here, the Pyramid of the Sun complex. And so then you have the city stretching up into Nørrebro. This is Rosenborg Palace around there. Here we are sort of in the southeastern pocket. Where I work is all the way down here, like near Island Bridge. All right, we'll talk about the real pronunciations later. Right, it has something to do with Iceland. Yeah, someone told me that. Okay. And there's some people who unfortunately are out over here in the harbor, and other people who are over here towards Fredericksburg, and some people who are clipped off the map. But it gives you an idea that this is a place of large scale, that, and you're walking here, everything, so no bikes like in Copenhagen, nobody's on a bike, there are no horses, there are no pack animals, everything is done on foot. And so imagine moving around this very large space. Here it is today, and the two major pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun over here and the Pyramid of the Moon over here, and this central artery that the Aztecs named the Street of the Dead. And another complex I'll look at, the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, is sort of off this map over here. But this sacred center had meaning to Teotihuacanos, and they planned it at this very high level of planning. First, the city seems to be harmoniously incorporating the mountains of the local landscape. And in fact, these pyramids, so we know that the Aztecs would refer to their temples often as sacred mountains, that they're representing a sacred mountain itself. And in this case, you have like an artificial cave under the Sun Pyramid, also associated with mountains. The calendar, and so here I just have to give you a tiny bit of math. Everyone knows the solar calendar is 365 days plus a quarter or so. But the Mesoamerican ritual calendar is really important for their religious system. It's 260 days. This is where feasts and certain ritual events, your name that had a lot of meaning about like your destiny in life came out of this 260-day calendar. To put the two together, you have the 260 plus 105 harmoniously linking the ritual and solar calendar. The symbolism of the particular pyramids I'll get to in a second, but they seem to convey messages associated with primal elements like water, fire, perhaps wind, and also big celestial bodies. Like, for instance, these names that the Aztecs give us might have actually some historical accuracy. The sun and the moon, and then the feathered serpent, who is Venus in the Mesoamerican pantheon. We also have this very planned unit of measurement that the whole city is conforming to. So let me just present those. First, up on the north, we have the Moon Pyramid, and you can see that it is mimicking the largest mountain in the Teotihuacan Valley. It's called Cerro Gordo over here, and the Moon Pyramid is right in front of it. We know that this statue was found about 150 years ago in front of the Moon Plaza. It's a female goddess, and she seems to be very similar to the deity of terrestrial waters in the Aztec pantheon. This is a massive, it's, I don't know, at least 3.5 meters high or so, big statue. There's a much cruder one that it's hard to make out, but it's the same female deity. So there seems to be associated with female deities, terrestrial water. And only recently has it been excavated. Here's another little reconstruction with people mulling about in what we call the Moon Plaza. This man over here, great man Rene Millen, just passed away two weeks ago. He was the man who originally mapped the site in the 1960s. And then these two are the people who directed the Moon Pyramid project that I was involved in, that involved tunneling down underneath the pyramid. So even though this pyramid had been reconstructed in the 1960s, that's when the Mexico City had the Olympics, and they brought the Olympic torch. Someone went running up the pyramid steps. So they fit it for this national event. It really hadn't been excavated. Nobody knew when it dated to, what was inside of it. And so by doing these tunnels starting in 1999 through the early 2000s, we now have a sequence. And the sorts of offerings that were made, 2 different construction episodes of the pyramid. These are dedicatory offerings made to consecrate a particular structure, and they involve some human sacrifice, and they are highly militarized. So, for instance, you can see that these individuals, they have their arms tied behind their backs. This, of course, is a mannequin for a museum display, but of a similar type. This is a different one, which had 3 individuals seated cross-legged, and these seem to be people who could have been foreigners. In fact, 2 of these might have been from the Maya area who were put into the pyramid, and we have some decapitation. Largely in Teotihuacan, the sacrifices match a demographic profile of war captives. They are males from about 18 to 40 years of age. They often have chemical bone signatures that say they are foreigners, that their bone chemistry is different from what we see within the city itself. But sometimes they would also incorporate locals or non-warriors. These offerings were part of bigger scenes that involved a suite of elements, including these huge obsidian knives, like you see over here in radial patterns, pyrite or fool's gold discs with big jade figures like this one standing on top of it. A lot of animals that also are more militaristically themed, like, for instance, eagles and wolves, rattlesnakes. And depictions of the storm god. And the storm god is pretty large. These water pots that were from this is the sky rains rather than the terrestrial waters of the other goddess that we saw. So we have a lot of then sort of aquatic associated images with the Moon Pyramid. In contrast, in the Sun Pyramid, we have a lot of fire symbolism. And this includes these big braziers that have the very identical iconography to the Aztecs when they did the new fire ceremony. So they did this ceremony when the ritual calendar and the solar calendar intersected every 52 years. They would have this huge ritual which involved extinguishing all the fires in the households. everyone broke their pottery. It was like a huge rite of passage. And here they bundled up the years, 13 times 4, and started a new fire. And we have those same braziers associated with the sun pyramid. And only recently, the fire god, it's hard to see, he's a little beat up, but this is the old god of fire. He was found in the summit of the sun pyramid. Again, with the mountains, when you're at the moon pyramid looking at the sun pyramid, it perfectly silhouettes the second largest mountain in the Teotihuacan Valley. So they're choosing this symbolism and this sacred landscape in different ways. To the south, we have the feathered serpent pyramid. This is the one that is the most elaborately adorned. It's the smallest of the 3, but there was a huge sculptural program associated with this. This is the god that the Aztecs called Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and the Maya had a version of him as well. He is, his face is on this side that was preserved, so the Teotihuacanos themselves covered over this pyramid about 100 years or so after it was constructed, and they seemed to have looted it and negated whatever this cult or this deity stood for. Here, the feathered serpent is wearing a headdress of a crocodilian figure. Mesoamericans saw the world as being on a floating crocodile's back. And so like we're in a primordial sea and we're on the crocodile's back. And this is the first day of the Aztec calendar, Cipatli. And so we think, art historians and archaeologists think, that this monument has something to do with this creative deity on the first day of creation, the creation of their era. We also see the same headdress, I should say, on this mural, and so that makes that connection a little stronger. Only recently, some fantastic offerings have been unearthed underneath the feathered serpent pyramid. There's a shaft going down 15 meters into what is essentially bedrock, this very hard material, and then going over 100 meters east underneath the temple. And Sergio Gomez, who's a Mexican archaeologist, has unearthed all these offerings, including these statues. There were 3 female ones, 1 smaller male statue, preserved organic remains, including balls from playing the Mesoamerican ball game, which is fantastic. We never had those. This is brand new stuff. More vessels with that storm god as well. I mentioned there was this looting episode. So this is, if there was one cataclysmic event in Teotihuacan's history before it collapsed, it was this. They spent all this time making this fancy sculpted pyramid, and then about 100 years or so later, and this also involved sacrifice of a lot of war captives within it, they chiseled down the heads of the feathered serpent, and you can see the remains strewn about the pyramid. And so there was some sort of rejection of the cult, of the deity, we're not sure, and they covered only this face over, and this is why the sculptures still preserve here. So rather than chip this one down, they covered it over, and it's remained preserved for us, and that's the one you visit at the site today. We also know that the Aztecs had a standardized unit of measurement that went from the tips of your fingers to your heart, which is roughly around 83 centimeters. And so extrapolating from that, Saburo Sugiyama has played around with some of these numbers for the major constructions at Teotihuacan and seen some fascinating things. Remember that ritual calendar is 260 days? That's the sun pyramid in the TMU, the Teotihuacan metric unit. The moon pyramid, when it first becomes monumental, corresponding with this construction, is 105. So the two then are complementary as the solar calendar. The citadel complex of the feathered serpent pyramid is 582. That's just close enough to the Venus cycle. So Venus does its heliacal cycle of when it comes up again as in the morning sky, goes away for a while, comes back in the night sky, comes back as morning star, is 584. The Aztecs associated Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, with Venus. And so perhaps that complex is also associated with that particular deity and cosmic body. Then another really fascinating thing about the orientation of the city. So they worked in these mountains, these sacred numbers. The way that the sun pyramid is looking on the western horizon is where the sun sets on April 29th and August 12th. And those dates are separated by 260 and 105. So they're getting, again, these two major calendrical cycles together, the ritual one and the solar one. So that's urban planning at this religious level of meaning, creating a sacred space that's meaningful within the context of a religious system. How about the plan from a more sociological urban planning system? Well, we can see, based on what has been excavated so far, that there is a concentric type model of the city. In fact, Gideon Sjoberg, who I think was Norwegian, but he's an urban planner who talks about the pre-modern model as being this sort of concentric one. Then Teotihuacan fits it just as well as anywhere. That you have this central palace and temple precinct. Then you have these neighborhood centers, this denser area of what you might call upper middle class housing or middle class housing, but also the central areas that have temples associated with houses. And then these peripheries. And these peripheries are the places where you see the most ethnic migrants, and you see a lot of intense craft production, but it tends to be of just common stuff. Potters, construction workers, stone tool makers. Where in here you have the nicer goods, the semi-precious stones and things like that. And so you certainly have this clear status hierarchy. So at the base of it is this apartment living, what's known as the apartment compound. Here's a nicer one reconstructed, where things are covered with lime, stucco, and painted. These are really fascinating housing types. For the ancient world, to have apartments that 20 to 60 people were living within the walls of a single compound, it's very rare that you have these sort of large houses. There are, again, remember, it's a semi-arid landscape. When they did the map, they could count 2,300 of these. So because of that, we can get really good population estimates for the city. And they seem to be associated with different craft activities that the family is specializing in. And we're still starting to learn more about these, and I'll come back to the apartment compounds. But stepping back for a moment, we could say that Teotihuacan has certain elements that make it seem more like a collective entity. That unfortunately is chopped off. But what do I mean by that? First, the art of the city de-emphasizes individuals. We don't ever see one named person as a powerful king or someone who is subordinate to another individual. There's deities who are then people are subordinated to. The deities are rendered large. There are scenes like this where there are deities and priests making offerings to particular deities, and then people are frolicking in this hill of water in this semi-arid landscape. This would be the ultimate good. And so in some ways there's a projection of a utopic order, keeping this cosmic order going, being subservient to the gods. In over 100 years of excavations at Teotihuacan, no one has ever found a royal burial. And this is pretty fascinating. My colleagues who work in the Maya area to the south, every summer there's a new Maya tomb unearthed. Teotihuacanos seem to not have had kings, or for a lot of its history, do not seem to have had a monarchy. It could have been for certain centuries, but for other periods, maybe an oligarchy, maybe something that was more like an elite assembly and aristocracy. The emphasis is on housing people and in these apartment compounds, housing gods in their huge temples. And they were able to incorporate many ethnic groups, up to 5 or so different languages. And so this relates to just a broader interest of mine and some of my colleagues in looking at the dynamics of cooperation and collective action or self-organization. And I liked at the beginning, for my introduction, there were some ants there. And what I was thinking of, I don't know if those are, in Teotihuacan we have these fire ants where when you're digging, they start burning you, and that's horrible. But we also think of ants in the context of complexity coming out of social insects. There's a lot of work in that sort of field, and people are comparing cities to, are they like ant colonies? In some ways yes, in some ways no. But some of my colleagues are applying this to Teotihuacan and other places, considering rather than top-down planning, very centralized planning, the more organic processes, emergent processes, bottom-up processes. And so that's one of my research interests. This is a recently edited book on this topic. Okay, so this brings us to the present research that I'm doing with colleagues in this southern Tlahinga district. Now remember, this was like, how did I butcher that name? Iceland Bridge over here, and then the Castellet is over here. So that's the distance that we are, somewhere way out on the periphery. But you can see that it's a really clear cluster of neighborhoods. We call it a district because it probably had some administrative functions. That's our hypothesis. Here are colleagues we work with at Mexico National University, UNAM, Luis Barba and colleagues who are doing ground-penetrating radar. So you see a mix of the excavation. We're stripping away layers the old-fashioned way with the shovel and a pickaxe and documenting the architectural remains and the artifacts, and then also using newer technologies to sense what's under the surface before excavating, or we might never get to it. It's, excavation is very costly, and remote sensing can be done much more rapidly. We're interested in a few different themes, including how did the city grow? How did it expand to the south? This area had only been worked at with one project for 2 years in the 1970s. They dug at one apartment compound. We wanted to look at a couple more, as well as the Street of the Dead. And how did the Street of the Dead expand into this area? What does that tell us about urban growth as a whole? How were commoners organized? So this is an area where just regular folks lived, probably the bottom third within the socio-political hierarchy of the city. And what was life like for them? How did they plug into the city's economy through their craft production and exchange relations? So first, starting at the broader level of spatial organization as a whole, we do some different geospatial techniques, including using drones and for mapping. This was the map done by René Milon and his colleagues in the 1960s. And you can see that there are multiple compounds here. They're nice sort of squares organized on these different pages that are each about half a kilometer. Each page represents half a kilometer. We now, of course, have technologies that can map much more precisely. And what we're seeing is that the district as a whole seems to have a less haphazard organization, as is represented here, but each individual apartment compound seems to be less regular. So there's greater room for variability that way that you just couldn't see from the surface. And I'll give you some examples. So one technique is LiDAR, which is a laser-based mapping from an airplane, is in the way that we used it. And here you can see subtle contour changes that come out really nicely when you play around with them in a GIS. And this organization seems very planned and very sort of rectangular for the district, unlike that page, the last one that was mapped in the 1960s. And we've been excavating in this area, as this is where the Street of the Dead continues over here, that's never been explored previously. We also, using terrestrial geophysical techniques or remote sensing, can see the footprints of architectural compounds underneath the surface without excavating them. So for instance, you can probably make out there's a compound over here, another one here, a corner of one over here, et cetera. And so this can all be done much more quickly than excavation. This is the one compound that was excavated in the 1960s. You'll notice it's now covered by housing, and this is a challenge we face in this area. It's becoming more urbanized, and so we lose parts of it. And so by documenting where there are compounds, we have a better idea before there's construction happening over these areas. And you can see that they have this more irregular pattern. They're not like the perfect rectangles on the map, and this one almost nicely mimics the one that was excavated. We then have been excavating over the last couple years. Here, just an image, you can see the pyramids way in the distance. That's that big mountain. And along the Street of the Dead in a couple different compounds, labeled 17 and 18. First, looking at the Street of the Dead. So we know in the center of town, this is a highly planned feature. This would be like the Broadway, as a New Yorker, of Teotihuacan, this central artery, nicely bounded with temples and palaces. That's not what we see down to the south. So the southern Street of the Dead is very different. It seems much more haphazard, but at the same time relatively planned. So you can see that people over here are respecting this center line coming from the Pyramid of the Moon to the south. This is a modern gas tube. Pay no attention to that diagonal. Teotihuacanos would hate something running that way. Everything has to be on this nice grid system. So there's nothing built in these spaces over here, but at the same time we see structures that are irregularly spaced. There's an urban planner called Spiro Kostov who talks about this, and he says, a city planner might have this idea for a nice avenue, but then the capricious behaviors of the bordering masses end in this more haphazard pattern. And I think that's what we're looking at in the southern Street of the Dead in this district. And we also see the construction done in this area, a mix of really difficult digging through this hard volcanic substrate. It's a volcanic tuft that's called tepetate, and they lowered this whole area to make this central artery. And so they dug down through this really tough material, and you can see where it's cut. We can also see that we're working with a German micromorphologist who's at the University of Tübingen, and she shows the difference between where there's a natural layer that is weathered and where it's cut. It's this very clean break between the sediments in this area. And so we can see where they cut it artificially. That's a big construction project, but then people make these very crude retaining walls that probably were just done on a piecemeal basis by the apartment compound. So then we have a mix of more centralized planning, maybe the district as a whole, maybe even a city planner doing this sort of construction process, the leveling, but then people filling in the landscape in a more organic or haphazard way. So looking at people's actual houses, what they're doing in them, first we see that people weren't always living in apartments. So we're finally getting a handle of the evolution of the apartment type as a form of Teotihuacan housing. We also see that there's really intense craft production of utilitarian goods and apprenticeship happening within compounds, and it doesn't seem that they're tied to any elite or to any city or state agency. And then finally, because they're doing this, they have an access to a really broad range of resources. And so people were migrating to the city because of the economic opportunities that it provided, like people still do in modern cities. Here's some evidence of that. So first, for this early occupation, down here you see these very informal floors with posts on them, making way to the nice apartment compound. So we have actually 8 superimposed floor levels here that can be nicely dated, give us a nice sequence for about 350 years of occupation here. And this shift from more organic thatch type housing to the apartment blocks that are typical of Teotihuacan. So we see this area become urbanized in housing type. We also see people change the way they did things. So they used to cook in hearths within their houses. But you could imagine when lots of people are living together in close proximity, you couldn't be lighting these big fires. And so they changed from their hearths down in these earlier levels to having these ceramic stoves. And they probably were cooking away outside and then reheating food in their ceramic stoves. And so it's an adaptive solution to this tight apartment compound living. One of the reasons we were interested in digging in this area is we had some of these ants, these fire ants, which helped us to deduce that this was an area that was very dense in obsidian. People in Teotihuacan did not have metals, so there was no metal technology. This was a city of over 100,000 people, occupied for centuries, making just stone tools. So because of that, this is probably the densest concentration of obsidian anywhere in the world that's not a quarry. So people came here and chipped all of this obsidian to make basic tools. These are tiny little pieces of blade cores. I went to the National Museum the other day. I saw the beautiful flint that used to be worked here in prehistoric times. So here they're near volcanoes and they're using obsidian. And these little ants told us where it is because they're bringing up little pieces from the surface. And so we dug here. And we'd like to say, as scientists, we do groundbreaking research. Of course, archaeologists do that very literally. And we also, if we study stone tools, are doing cutting-edge research. Those are my corny puns. And we see the whole production sequence of making this utilitarian good. We had over 420 kilos of obsidian from just this area that we excavated over here. So this mass of obsidian that people were working to make this utilitarian cutting tool, something you'd use in kitchens. And thankfully for us, they're burying stuff. So Mesoamerican peoples see structures as animated. They still do today. The Nahuas and Mayas will have house rituals where they make an offering to the house in consecration of it. And same thing back in prehistoric times. And so people are making offerings to the physical house and burying things in these little cysts. Here you have a nice, this is, anyone who's enjoyed Mexican food know that you grind corn in this mano and metate, and then you can make tortillas or tamales with the cornmeal. That's covering this deposit of obsidian in a few pots, chock full of all these nice blade cores where they're taking off regular blades and also some points. Where we can see apprenticeship, I am someone who enjoys making stone tools as just a hobby, but also a way of learning the economic production process. And I sit down with students and we make stone tools. I'm like an intermediate level. There's some people who are fantastic, and then some people who are just getting started. And once you chip enough stone, you have an idea of what goes into it. Like, is someone producing at a high level or a low level? And probably you can tell just from looking at these that this is a pretty nicely made point. This would take someone, probably months of sitting down and trying to make stone tools to produce something like that. That's a skilled napper, is the term we use for someone who chips stone. Whereas here, someone has made two catastrophic errors. We'd call them hinge fractures. They've dug into it. They hit the stone too hard, and it dug right into the center of it. And this is not a desirable outcome, but it's okay, intermediate. On day 2, you could be doing this. I mean, this is someone who is just getting started. This is a crappy point. And we know that there's a range of ability here. Likewise, this is a masterpiece in stone. Whoever made this blade core could control stone, just the ways like those Neolithic daggers that are in the National Museum here. It's a master of stone. Where here, someone has chewed this thing up, and that's someone who's just getting started. So we can see evidence that there's production in the household, that the trade is being passed on within the family. Another nice part about this offering is it contained a couple of pots, and this one is a nicer one within Teotihuacan ceramics because it's been covered with stucco and painted, just like the walls were. And so people had access to a nicer type of ceramic ware. It has a nose adornment, so people would perforate their septum and put in these nose pieces, but these are not nose plugs that you would find anywhere out on the periphery of the city, like at Tlajenga. This is stuff that you see on top of elite warriors, or this is the water goddess again and the water god. So it's on deities, it's on important personages, the actual emblems of authority. And they have a pot that's reflecting those emblems of authority, and it was a nicer ware for them. They had access to some nice stuff, and we can actually see that they needed to patch it up. So this is a pre-Columbian patch that they've added some stucco here because it was splitting apart. So this gives us a picture of a family that has some access to nice resources but needs to take care of it. They don't have ample access to this sort of ware. They also had access to marine shell coming from both the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico. So they were plugged into these exchange routes that went across Mexico. These aren't huge shells. The elites of Teotihuacan would not be impressed by their size, but nevertheless, they are plugged into this broader world economy of the time. Finally, up to the north, we excavated another compound, and this is also where we saw the earlier occupation. The architecture in general in this area is relatively simple, but they save the nicer stuff for their patios. This is where they have the cut stone blocks, and they do this stone floor of this southern patio. And here's where we saw a termination ritual that found some exciting stuff. So when Mesoamericans consecrate something, they make an offering, they also will terminate something by smashing pots and leaving offerings before they leave. And that's what they did here. and they smashed all these big pots and left us this nice mask. So this, again, is giving us an indication that these people with regular humdrum cooking vessels being smashed here also had some access to nicer things, like a stone sculpted mask. These are the sort of iconic masks or sculptures of Teotihuacan. There's been about 120 that are known throughout world collections, but only about 10 of them have been excavated. So this is a very small sample size, and it's giving us a better appreciation for how they were used. So people used to think these were put on mortuary bundles, like you would put it over a dead person's face. It's really heavy. It would just crush their skull. And you can also see that it's perforated, but the eyes aren't dug out, aren't hollowed, so a living person presumably wouldn't wear this. So it's probably put on something solid, like a post or like an effigy body, which we know that the Aztecs did. And so this would be probably an ancestor, an important personage within the compound who was then venerated or made offerings to within these patios. So this helps us to give a face to Teotihuacano commoners, tell their story. They were part of this picture. They are the 90 to 120,000 strong of this city. It's their production that is the economic base of this place. And through household archaeology, through excavating houses rather than the big monuments, we can help flesh out the broader story here. So what happened to Teotihuacan? So the collapse is always one of the million-dollar questions. There seems to be some evidence of possible climatic stress. This comes from a stalagmite south of Mexico City. It's at a distance, but it's showing a period that's an extended drying interval. And so this could have caused some stress. But we do also see that Teotihuacan lived through some real downturns in climate. So that must mean that there's probably some social stresses happening at the same time. What we do know is that things are being systematically burned in the center of the city at around the mid-6th century AD. We also see from a regional picture, its trade corridors being shut off, and the city as a whole goes through a political collapse into city-states. There's still probably about 20 to 40,000 people living here in a reduced city-state until around 8900, and that's when the Toltec period takes off. So even though there is collapse, there is renewal, and there is resilience within central Mexico. Here's just some evidence of that. So next to the moon pyramid, we would find the big roof beams that had burned and collapsed down to the floor. In one palace compound, they had this big marble statue that they smashed on the floor. And this gives you some of that regional picture where they controlled trade corridors out to the Gulf of Mexico. This was a Teotihuacan-associated site right in this perfect corridor. That gets abandoned, and people go up into the hills, which usually is an indication of some conflict if people have to fortify. So we're trying to understand that picture more. A new project that I'm getting involved in is the other side of the coin of a palace, but here not looking at the big structures, rather the out-of-the-way places, to try to understand, are these storage facilities? Did servants or retainers live here? What is the economic production happening within a palatial complex that would tell us something about the political economy of this place? And so those are questions yet to answer. I'm happy to also address any questions you might have today. And here I end with some Teotihuacan cocktails, and of course the fermented maguey, and say thank you and salud, or what is it in Danish? Skål? Skål. Skål. All right, salud. Happy to answer questions.